Hello, everybody. It's your Chapo. It's your Chapo for this week. I believe that's the first time I get to say that on the app.
I think so. I can't remember another time.
Well, it feels good. We are here, just me and Matt this week, to go over some stuff. And we kind of decided to do just
this is like that classic Krusty episode where he talks to George Meany about collective bargaining agreements.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we're going to do. 90 minutes.
Yep.
Of is there a labor crisis in America?
We interrupt Felix listing Fortnite guys if they were Albanian to give you instead this discussion of current events.
But kind of the impetus of this is that I don't even know if we've mentioned on the show, but since maybe the beginning of quarantine, Matt has been doing these live streams and honing some tenets of Christmanist thought.
Yeah.
And I kind of, we've the last week or so, we've kind of been responding to this wave of protests amid the pandemic, amid the presidential election. We've kind of just been like, it almost feels like you're in front of like a tennis ball machine and you're just like swatting them as they come.
Yeah, you're just eating them in the face and balls.
Yeah, so I thought we could maybe take some of this Christmanist thought that I've been absorbing since I watch every one of the streams to kind of go through and make sure that there's nothing too insane for me before I put
Which
them on,
I very much appreciate.
Yeah, on YouTube. So I thought that I'd kind of be a sounding board and tee Matt up to talk about the things. And if you like this, then maybe you can follow up on the live streams.
Yeah, they're all on YouTube.
On Twitch or on YouTube.
Get frickin' Chris that goddamn YouTube button already.
We're at 66,000 subscribers, 34,000 more, and I get the trophy.
If you think nothing of me, and nor should you, just do it for this man, the hardest working Chapo by far. Give him his adorable YouTube plaque.
But let's start with this. Let's start granular and personal experience and then kind of zoom out. Matt, you got in a protest this week?
I did. And it's been a pretty amazing experience is that I've gone out 3 or 4 times this week with no plan, really. I met my friend for one march, but other than that, I would just, if the afternoon, I would walk outside. I do live relatively near the Barclay Center, which is a real focal point for protesting. So I just walk around Flatbush Avenue, and then I will just run into a giant march.
Yes, it's insane. And
then at 2 separate times, I've left one march to go home, and then on the way home, hit another one, and then join that one for a while. That's the thing that's bonus amazing is the sense of spontaneity, which a lot of people like. It's a double-edged sword. We'll talk more about that. But yes, just yesterday, I went out on Flatbush. I looked up and down the street. About 5 minutes later, there were 1,000 people there walking up towards Atlantic. I walked with them. I kind of thought it was one of the smaller protests I'd seen. If it was like maybe a block long. But then by the time we got to the intersection of Flatbush and Atlantic, and I looked back, the entire street was people all the way to Grand Army Plaza. Like people just filled in behind. It's kind of like a musical, when someone starts walking and singing, and then people start
the 76 trombones, them.
Like Les Mis shit. It does have a Les Mis vibe to it.
Yes. I also live very close to Barclays. I think somebody on we were monitoring on Instagram who was saying yesterday that basically protests were leaving on the hour from Barclays, like it was a tour group or something. That was my experience Friday night. That I met up with a few people and we basically we walked from Grand Army Plaza to Barclays and we're just kind of hanging around there for a second, and then a group walked by and we were just like, okay, we'll get with those, and we ended up walking something like 10 miles through central Brooklyn down into Flatbush and then back up and around. That was kind of interesting because the protest itself had very good vibes, and we were getting support through the it was very peaceful protest, and we were getting support from everybody that we saw along the route. But then it came out afterwards that particular one of our city council members was in the group and had coordinated with the cops to basically, and the protesters apparently, to basically meet the cops at 11 p.m. and then they would peacefully disperse so as not to create a clash with the cops. The cops would not arrest anybody, but the protests would disperse 3 hours after curfew. And I saw a few people who were pretty salty about that concept of that kind of collaboration and coordination with the police. And I don't know. I think that's a difficult thing to describe because you basically have to, like, when we set off from Barclays, was it our goal to get arrested or not arrested from that night? And I don't think anybody there knew.
And that is the other edge of the double-edged sword of spontaneity and an uncoordinated activism, is that you are left sort of in rudderless and at the mercy of people who will take charge.
Right.
And we're already seeing that happening. There's apparently, I think it was in New York, there's a male model who's now appointed himself a community leader and is liaisoning with the police and having photo ops with the cops and organizing the protests with them. I'm not sure what city that is, but you could look it up. He is a brand ambassador and actor. Like a guy fucking ran to the front of a protest with his headshots and handed them to one of the white shirt Tony Baloney's uncle.
Oh, by the way, have you stood in support with Joe Baloney yet?
Always. I support both Baloneys. People forget there was a cop who pepper sprayed a girl during Occupy, and his name was Tony Baloney.
I remember Tony Baloney.
Yeah, Tony and Joey fighting in your soul for eternity. But that's the problem. And then you're like, why? Where are we going? What are we doing? And without a coherent message around which to rally and people to exercise strategy on behalf of a larger group of people, discipline, in other words, some sort of party-based structure, the danger is that you will either dissipate or you will be corralled into acceptable parameters. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, not to be corny, but I kept thinking about the Rage Against the Machine line from Sleep Now in the Fire, raise your fist and march around, just don't take what you need.
Indeed.
If the protest doesn't come into conflict with some kind of power structure, then what is it actually protesting?
That's because there's a certain there's an ambiguity at the heart of this, I think, because traditionally and definitionally, a protest in the frame we're seeing, peaceful demonstrations, if you were to analyze their, even if the people don't even know what the goal is, practically the goal of a demonstration is to make an appeal to authority, right? On behalf of a certain issue, and to demand change in that authority's relationship to that issue, right?
Right.
That is different than an insurgency or an insurrection, which attempts to displace and remove and overthrow a power. And like you could say that at moments, people involved in some of these specific conflicts with the cops, especially early on, like maybe the first Friday night here in New York when they were burning the cop cars or something.
Or when they set fire to the precinct in Minneapolis.
Yeah, exactly. The initial insurrectionary act, literally failing to acknowledge the authority of the police. And then everyone else saying, holy shit, you can do that?
Yes.
Wow. And then, of course, coupled with, parenthetically, the fact that, it was a way to go out of the house without feeling like you were being selfish after being cooped up. I mean, the role of Corona and the quarantine in all this has to be kept in mind at all times. Because it's very hard to see this happening outside of that context, which has repercussions and it influences, what's going to be effective and how this is likely to shape up. What was I saying, though?
Insurrection.
All right. So, but I would say at this point, especially once the cops realize that if they let the gas off a little bit, they wouldn't get as much pushback. I would say now they're getting bigger. Like there were 20,000 people in LA yesterday, right? But they're also much more peaceful. And partially that, of course, that's the cops failing to incite, but it's also a lack of an insurrectionary agenda and a goal among people on the demonstration. Which means that we have settled into, because frankly, we shouldn't be doing an insurrection. There's no power that could affect a revolution in the United States. Well, how high would you have to be to think we're in anything like that moment right now? You can maybe build durable institutions out of this, could come someday down the line, challenge capitalism, but we are not in a place where this movement, whatever you want to call it, is in a position to overthrow and existentially challenge power, which means it's demonstrating against it.
Yeah,
well, it's demonstrating for it to change its policies, which means it's accepting the legitimacy. At the end of the day, it's accepting the legitimacy of those institutions.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is how we've seen the first week of this protest, and then thinking back to some of the wilder moments in Ferguson, some of the earlier moments, that the initial stages of these Black Lives Matter protests are usually more insurrectionary. And I guess one of the things that I was thinking about as I was seeing the crowd and the tactics and the atmosphere of these protests is that it kind of is this convergence of two different strains. And I would call one of them the maybe the more insurrectionary Black Lives Matter protests, and then the women's march crowd, the more maybe lefty, maybe traditional Democratic Party progressive crowd that then is that cooler that wants to come in with the I'd rather be at brunch signs,
right?
Which thankfully we've
Because
not seen that much of that kind of aesthetic in there. But I think that it is that crowd that more or less learned how to do that kind of thing in the early days of the Trump administration, glomming on to the
right. But the thing is that even that initial edge of insurrection in those moments, they are just impulses, though. They're undirected. They're spontaneous.
Right.
So that means, by definition, if they're not directed and stoked and kindled, they will go out.
Right.
Which is what happens, because there's only so many people who are that terminally alienated from an authority, from the systems of control, that they're willing to risk like actual significant imprisonment and maybe death.
Right.
That's a slim margin of people. And so once that is extinguished, that rouses, like you're talking about, people who but those people are also less alienated from the system, less willing to risk to oppose it. And I'm not judging that. I'm not saying that is a character flaw. It is just a fact. It's not even conscious. It is a subconscious adherence to norms because of your ingrained fear of oppression. If you try to push against them, which is a real thing. And that the only way you overcome that is if you have a sufficient enough organized and sized force to oppose it, in which you could feel like there's any hope of success. And that's what you have to build from numbers.
Right. And that's in that my personal experience of being in that crowd that had its like negotiated stand down, where, some people were pissed that a negotiated stand down with the cops on Saturday night occurred, and those people have that more impulse. But I'm sure another huge portion of that crowd would hear that story and be like, thank you, councilman.
And we're frankly
for preventing me from getting arrested.
They're probably relieved.
Yeah.
They're probably relieved. And there is this fantasy, I think, because people spend their time honing these beliefs online and feel that they're so much a part of their identity that to say this is to judge people. No, there are greater and lesser amounts to lose. There are greater and lesser investments in your life that are psychologically connected to the system that you live under in a way that you don't even know about. You're not making this choice even yourself to be the insurrectionary or the demonstrator. The idea that enough people could will themselves into making the jump from one to the other spontaneously, not absent a change in conditions, that is, I think, a fantasy that only can persist if people are conceptualizing their politics entirely online.
Right. And it feels so dismissive and insulting to say that, protesting for the vast majority of people like myself, like my friends, that it is more or less an aesthetic choice.
Yeah.
But it's true. It's the case. And until I can look into my heart, until all my friends can look in their heart and say, no, I'm ready to go to jail for this cause.
And there's two things that can change that percentage in people. One is if they have less to lose because things are worse. And that's honestly a thing that we have to reckon with, might actually prolong this more than anything else, is if this economic recession really starts smacking down and dominoes of economic distress start falling, then people are going to have less to lose. That's one way that's one factor that will make them more likely to become insurrectionary. The other is if they think that they can win, if they think they can do it without dying, without going to jail for a long time, by changing things. And that's what a lot of people, I think, are doing now. They're convincing, because they don't have it that bad. They aren't that desperate. They aren't that willing to sacrifice. But they convince themselves, okay, we actually can be successful in the moment. And that's sort of an auto-hypnosis. And they do it so that they can push further. You know what I mean? And I think that is where the police abolition thing comes from.
Right.
I think that when people explain why abolition is a goal, it's never in the terms of how is this relating to a broader demonstration movement to change actual positions under actual capitalism, given our actual existing intact institutions, because we are not going to overthrow them. And so therefore we can only change conditions within them. Right?
Right.
So there is no argument, in my opinion, to say abolish in that. If you are arguing how do we get the biggest coalition that will last the longest, get the most coherent demands, and apply them with the most consistent pressure on powers that be to do the things that you're talking about, reduce the size of police forces, reduce police armaments, for God's sake, take away their guns, make them have oversight, make them have to live in the fucking communities. I mean, that is all the people, and if you push abolitionists, they'll say, yes, even under capitalism, there will always be police, but they'll look like this. And you're saying, but my response to that is, but that's not abolishing the police.
Right.
And the argument is, no, it's so different than the current paradigm that it's actually radically different. And I would say to that, that's why you convinced yourself it's radical enough to support. That's not how you convince other people.
Right.
You know, like you are already convinced. You've already done the reading where you're like, oh, abolition really means X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
For people who are not already on board, they don't have that built-in understanding of it. And the internet makes all these conversations so frictionless that people assume, if they don't know what we mean by abolition, then they don't want to know. And that is because you're not really trying to expand the base. What you have to do the job that you need to do in terms of show that you can actually move the needle. Like that's the hope. The hope out of this is that the hope to come out of this, in my opinion, is that you move the needle, because that could teach an entire generation of young people who are staring down the barrel of just a desolate hellscape of pandemic, climate collapse, and economic stagnation and ruination, and say, hey, you can change things. There are levers here that if there are enough of us grab, we can move. And that is why if you have brittle demands that can either be co-opted or will run out of steam because not enough people buy the underlying premises, then people are disillusioned even further.
Right.
Further convinced that, okay, I guess we're fucked. I guess I will just game until I die, until the seas claim me, because what is the difference? And that's the biggest danger out of this is, yes, there are a lot of really bad outcomes we could get. We could get police defunding and replaced with private security forces.
With Elon Musk's Ed 209s.
Exactly. We could get, honestly, the thing I'm most terrified of is that like the liberal cognitive dissonance happens when nothing really changes after all of that marching, makes the HR like inquisitor model of social justice, like the coercive, who's your boss, you're fired, become even more oppressive and even more overwhelming, which is literal poison to any possibility of class solidarity in this country. It's like setting The Thing from the John Carpenter movie out in the fucking landscape to have these liberals in positions of influence in media and in employment waving this woke orthodoxy over people's heads like the sword of Damocles. That will alienate people, because not everybody went to college and not everybody accepts these underlying premises. They could be brought around to them, but not in that context. So there's a lot of dangers, and that is why I'm glad that the movement, to the degree this happened from abolition to defunding, has occurred, and I think it needs to move farther than that, because there's a second clause with defunding that needs to be added for people who aren't on board, which is we're not just taking money from the cops so that there are fewer cops in the same context of cities that in a lot of places are deeply dysfunctional and have a lot of pathologies and crime in them and have to be engaged with. You reduce those by taking that money and putting it elsewhere.
It's refunding.
Exactly. Yeah. Refunding. And I think like the value of demonstrations, the value of this moment is that it might get people off of the internet. It might get them snapped out of it enough to engage with politics on the ground rather than in the sky. And I think the move towards defunding from abolition is encouraging. And my hope is that if this moment doesn't dissipate and there is the sense that we can get something real, that it needs to push farther than that. Like a lot of people are declaring victory about Minnesota, saying that they're going to reform their police department.
That's one of those things where I'll believe it when I see it.
But even if they did it, if they're rebuilding it in a context in which this whole movement has guttered out, like movements in the past like it have, and it's happening without the oversight, without the pressure, without the huge media microscope on it, then it's going to look like swapping out cops for Blackwater guards or something.
Right.
Or even strategically removing police just to see if crime rises.
Yeah. You know?
And doing sort of the opposite of what they do now, which is strategically allow places to suffer malign neglect. And if you don't change the underlying economic conditions, you can't assume that crime's going to drop that much.
But it does feel like this very narrow window where maybe, like, if you get the defunding coupled with the refunding, like, that is something that seems like it could be in action fairly revolutionary, but also palatable to a large number of people and understandable. And that's like the thing that you were talking about. I mean, that mentality of it's not my job to educate you about the true meaning of abolishment, but defunding, refunding, simple demand. Almost everybody would be like, yeah, let's give some money to schools. One less cruiser, and then a stack of cruiser-shaped textbooks to the high school.
Yeah. I mean, there might actually be, I think there is to some degree a positive feedback loop here, but whether it becomes self-sustaining is a question of how things play out, and who can know that at that point. But I think there can be a positive feedback loop whereby if these protests continue and they increase and they keep pushing power to make accommodations that are, of course, flimsy, not worth the paper they're even tweeted on, and just meant to mollify. But that even in the face of that, you don't see the co-optation. You don't see the dissipation of energy, or worse, like the coalescing around like unrealistic or conflicting goals happen. If that doesn't occur, that there might be a positive feedback loop between the people who right now like need to think in abolitionist mindsets in order to convince themselves that this moment is revolutionary enough to invest all their anima into, all their jouissance into. If you keep seeing things change, even if it's just the enemy sort of strategically retreating, that maybe reduces your need to feel like you're in an insurrection, and maybe you can let go of that one fist that's still sort of wrapped around this idea that no, we're actually overthrowing capitalism now, and recognize that this is a moment in which you might see the creation of durable institutions of left political influence in this country, which have not existed for 40 years.
Right.
But that would be the residue. That is what we could hope for. I mean, yeah, sure. The whole thing could fall apart like the Winter Palace in 1917, but that's very unlikely, and you can't assume it's going to happen. You have to sort of assume that these are durable institutions for the very simple fact that they've endured for so long, and more importantly, your relative to it lack of coordination.
Right.
So I'd say everybody needs to stop assuming ahead of time whether this quote unquote succeeds or fails. I feel like a lot of people anyway, have made up their mind ahead of time. People who are participating and people who have decided not to have made their head up ahead of time whether, this is going to result in Y, and that could be revolution. It could be some significant like urban, like dual power relationship that is a challenge to existing capitalism, or the creation of, or at least the nascent formation of an actual network of people that could exercise political power in this country as the crisis unfolds and continues and expands, and it fuels the fires of discontent that can be utilized and channeled now that you actually have an institutional framework. And whatever it is, they've already decided. And I just say to people, you don't know. No one knows what's going to happen. So you have to, it's just your responsibility to engage with it as it is, not as you imagine it will be even a week from now.
And again, going back to what I was saying about how this feels like the confluence of two different types of movements, I think you can see that happening. You have evidence of what you're saying happening, basically, is that, we saw the first steps of these people figuring out how to do this in Ferguson. We saw then all the middle class libs figuring out how to do this with like the Women's March and subsequent protests. And now this feels like a much more well exercised muscle. I mean, it is, as we were saying at the beginning, amazing to see the kind of spontaneous coordination that results in a march leaving every hour from Barclays Center. But it's because people have learned how to do it this generation.
And hopefully the next thing they will learn is how to take it beyond the level of demonstration.
Yeah.
Take it to different levels of conflict and contest with power.
Right.
And with capital. As workplaces, of course, would be the best if that could come out of this.
Yes.
That would really be the dream. If we could reattach some of those severed nerves between political consciousness and American workers, and if this could provide any fuel for that, that'd be phenomenal. There doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I mean, like a lot of people point to rightly the co-optation by woke capitalism of the Black Lives Matter movement. You've got Raytheon talking about how they value black lives. Offer not applying to Somalia or Djibouti. But they're doing that because they want to make sure that this is channeled into meaningless reform. That's why the Senate and House leadership of the Democratic Party today performed one of the most baffling and nauseating acts of self-abnegation I have ever seen. They donned kente cloths and kneeled in the Capitol Dome for 9 minutes. You can't even make up anything anymore. Why is anyone trying to make up things?
Certainly, Wakanda Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer was not something I had imagined seeing. But at the same time,
it's over the top for a joke.
Yeah.
You wouldn't make that joke.
Yes,
you wouldn't make that joke. And now it's like she's literally there with the outfit. You don't even have to make. You're not even really joking to say like she's going to mandate bean pies in the House cafeteria. Or like they're going to give this Congressional Medal of Honor to General Muck Muck.
I think friend of the show, Jack Wagner, said it best that we live in this surreal time where about twice a week you see something where you can't remember if it was a joke that you and your friends made up in a group DM or not.
Yeah, no, it's all intermingled now.
Yeah,
Hotep Nancy Pelosi, was that on Cumtown? I don't remember.
But I want to stick with this or maybe go back to this idea of aesthetics and talk about another thing that you've been talking a lot on your streams is you yourself have wrestled with it, and I think it is a time for everyone to wrestle with it, which is posting. And just one of these things I'm sure everybody who's listened to this has seen is I've especially noticed it on Instagram is like everyone overnight their Instagram just turning into a massive a constant reading list recommendation for every book about white
frailty,
white frailty and stuff.
By the way, the author of White Frailty is Italian. She's a white lady.
Excellent. Well, it takes an Italian with that much
it's true.
strength and guilt to look inward and write something like that. But it's just kind of hilarious seeing like all these people recommending dozens and dozens of books that they themselves have not read and being like, it's finally time to sit down and watch the 13th on Netflix. And I find it funny, but I also find it I have sympathy to people because people don't have any way to express their political feelings other than this aesthetic way, this posting, and
and that's why I think this is a moment that no matter what you have to seize, you have to engage with, because as perhaps low percentage, I guess you'd say, as demonstrations tend to be now in the political context of the United States, they still have a higher percentage than posting.
Right.
Posting as a vocation, posting as the sum total of one's political engagement is a recipe for sterile stagnation and doom, because you are playing all of these chess matches against the Capitol by yourself,
right,
on both sides. And you can't really do that. You can only really play chess against another consciousness. So you can only really engage politically by relating to the world around you. You can't figure out all the moves ahead of time in your head and then act like the game's already over. And that to do that is what the internet is basically designed to, because that is one more thing that makes it addictive. Because now your political dissatisfaction and alienation and sense of what's right gets to be channeled onto a profitable way by clicky, clicky, clicky.
Yes.
You get all the ads and you got the clicks and they got the money and you get to feel like you've done something.
Right.
And breaking that, and the great gift of this movement is it breaks that cycle. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean good will come from that, because these are we do live in a overdetermined neoliberal moment of atomization, racialization, class completely invisible in American life, that makes any kind of sustained, effective counter mobilization very difficult. But if the idea is to post it into existence by crafting the perfect arguments and then making them to enough people that spontaneously you convert them to your side, that will never work. That is doomed to fail. But it is sure as shit also going to make a lot of money for Jack Dorsey in the meantime.
One of the things that you said that I think I've personally tried to internalize a little bit, and I think is correct, is like, if enough people recommend white fragility on Instagram, maybe some people are actually going to see that and pick up a copy of it and read and maybe learn something. But I think
I don't want him to read White Fragility, though. That's the thing. Half the stuff is garbage.
Sure,
half the stuff is designed to where like what the moment calls for is for white people to feel worse.
Well, that's what I was going to get to.
Racism and that is a recipe for basically emotional burnout among all these white people. They're not going to be able to handle that level of trying to craft themselves into the perfect like abject subject the perfectly repentant sinner, because that's going to cause one of the people who go after that are going to get a nervous breakdown, and eventually the rest of the white people are going to be like, "Fuck that! What is the point of this? What's in it for me?" Because guess what, people? Politics is about what's in it for me. Now, the socialist case is that what's good for everybody is best for everybody, and I think that that's a persuasive case. But there has to be an element of self-interest in it too, to hook people who don't already have your point of view.
Right.
And that is what people have just because it's so easy to create a completely hermetic and hegemonic worldview on the internet. You can really believe that is representative of anything like a majority of people, and it 1,000,000% is not.
Well, the thing that I think that's all right, but the thing I was going to get into is that you have to kind of internalize that any of that recommendation or anything that you're posting, whether it's recommendations for anything, good or bad, that ultimately you are doing it for yourself.
Yes.
That it is purely to, and maybe it can be a healthy exercise to think through some things that you're thinking or try to reinforce values within yourself, but nothing is ever like the target audience for any post you make. You can never think of it as someone else. It is always for you. And I think that this is like it's like a step, right? Because we were talking about, I was talking about aesthetics earlier, like embracing an aesthetic of protesting is not just like, I'm not trying to say that as a critique of people. I'm saying that is something that everybody needs to work through to get to the next level. And I'm not saying I'm there either. Right. I'm just thinking about having to work through this myself.
The danger is that because like the Marxian concept of of political self-interest involves working class people working on what they view as a class project, that they view that there is a collective goal that we should strive for because it will help all of us.
Right.
We don't have that idea, so people are operating out of individualized political motivations, and because left-wing political thought is so moralized, and it should be. I mean, it is a fundamentally moral thing. But because it's so morally based, and because class is so diffused, and because there is such unequal distribution of resources, that a lot of people's liberal and leftist politics are bound up in being selfless.
Right.
The idea of altruism as the full motivator.
Right.
And so therefore, there's a real danger that politics then becomes completely symbolic, because all you need to do is do a ritualized abeyance.
Like those people who were kneeling to give up white privilege.
Oh boy! Apparently, in Cary, North Carolina, some white protesters washed the feet of the black organizers.
Amazing. I mean,
oh boy!
Again, it's obviously like we're trying to talk around like the structural problem of like changing power dynamics involved with that. But again, I have sympathy for these people because there is no other way to express.
No, that's the thing. There's a limit to which we can blame anybody on any of these for falling for any of this shit, because that's what it's there for.
Protesting cringe, as it were.
If it didn't work, it wouldn't happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like these systems reproduce these things because it's antibodies. It's cultural antibodies. And so those have to be fought through, and not everyone is going to be able to do it immediately. Not everyone's going to have read enough posts to be able to instantly apply a rubric towards their actions that is perfectly aligned with the moment. It's got to be learned. It's got to be learned over time. And that is why people have to embrace the idea, not only that they don't know what's going to happen, but that more likely than not, whatever they're imagining as the best case scenario will not happen.
Right.
That is, you have to have already died, inside. You have to have killed that part of you that thinks that it's going to work. Now, it might work, like I said, but you can't operate from the assumption it will, because it will deform your actions, and it will make you less responsive to the world around you, because you have to deny what's occurring, because you can't accept in your head the mortality of the moment. You have to accept that failure is always the most likely outcome, and that the point is to engage so as to gain for the future,
right?
As to create something that wasn't there before out of that tumult that can be applied maybe to even greater advantage later on. A slow, steady, grinding effort in which every moment, even as dramatic and huge as this seems, and it is unprecedented, that these are still just almost pinpoints on a very slow moving graph. Sisyphus with his fucking shoulder to the goddamn boulder, and that it is the struggle that will build anything durable and meaningful. But that requires not assuming, not depending on it being successful, not embracing a triumphalism out of a psychological compensation mechanism.
And of course, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. I
must imagine Sisyphus posting.
And the thing is that, I want to be clear that I can kind of...
Let me be clear.
I can intellectually wrap my head around these, but I don't know if these ideas, but I cannot say that I have emotionally embraced that idea that, that nothing ever will be good. Or I may never see anything be better.
You may never see anything good.
I don't know if I'm ready there.
No one alive now may see anything. No one alive now may ever see the promised land. That's a real thing that has to be really cellularly assimilated.
But I keep getting this image in my head of like if you squeeze like a ball of putty really quickly and like you don't know what'll happen, but like maybe a little squirt of it will come out like randomly between your knuckles one way, and that may be the change that you did not expect. Like the Minneapolis City Council disbanding their police department, and we don't know if that's a good or bad, as we were talking about earlier, improvement yet. But it's something that happened.
This is why you have to assume it will fail always, because if you have like you say, that's a perfect analogy actually, squeezing it and it comes out of one of the finger holes.
Yeah,
that. If you have your eye fixed on a goal, on a victory, then there has to be some sort of quality to it, right? It has to be defined in some sort of way, right? For you to imagine it, to strive towards. And if you fix too much on that because you think it's in grasp, then when pressure is applied and something pops up elsewhere, where like the stalemate breaks in a way that was not predicted because of the random distribution of events, the butterflies on butterflies on butterflies that determine physical reality that cannot be accounted for, that you were able to change directions, pivot towards the new fracture. And you can't do that if you are fixed on thinking that you're going to get to X or Y.
Right.
You have to be able to look at Z when it pops around the corner.
Well, let's continue widening the lens. So as we kind of talked about our individual experiences at the protests, and now we're talking about like the aesthetics and demands and accomplishments in general. But let's stick with the theme of nothing ever getting better.
And talk Hell World, baby.
And talk about Joe Biden.
He's vibing, folks.
He's vibing. Well, not specifically Joe Biden, because one of the other things that I've been thinking about that makes this moment so difficult to predict what's going to happen is just the overall complete inadequacy of our governing institutions, in the sense that they don't even seem to have the ability to do anything anymore.
No. I mean, that's what we learned. That's what we learned over the course of the COVID quarantine. Oh my God, there's nothing coming.
Yeah.
That nobody's whipping up a strategy here. It's that scene, that scene in Apollo 13 when there's a leak in one of the filters or something.
And they're figuring out how to do it with the milk crate and the coffee filter.
He dumps the thing full of all the odds and ends they have on the ship and say they have to make this square thing go into this round thing with this.
Yeah.
And then cut 20 minutes later, they drop it on the desk. I think we all have maybe this dim idea, this mid-century naive vision of not politics and the political state, but just the architecture of American bureaucracy. The clock punchers, the NASA guys.
Yeah.
The medical NASA guys. And that's so when we all went indoors at the end of May, was it? Oh, no,
March.
April. It was
mid-March was the
it was
last time,
I believe it was June 1945. That's how long it has felt like it has been. But we all kind of had this thing. Okay, now there's going to be something. Someone's going back there and they're going to whip up a little doohickey or something. No. They were doing nothing. Everybody in the Trump administration was just selling each other multi-level marketing scams, and that was it. Yeah. And now we've all given up. And this is all part, by the way, people need to acknowledge that this is all part. This burst of demonstrations is part of that breaking up,
right?
That dawning realization that there's no cavalry coming, that the state is completely non-functional, and that therefore the selfless act of staying indoors is liberal virtue signaling to yourself.
Yes.
you stay home and it's like, this sucks, but I'm a better person than those chuds who are out hooting around in Fuddruckers at Possum Dick, Arkansas. But then a moment like this comes and, hey, I could go out and still feel good about myself. And that's not bad. That's not a condemnation. It's an opportune moment when things come together. It's how history works. It's fucking it's structures meeting with happenstance. And that's what creates the moment of opportunity.
Right. But yeah, there's this incredible sense of brittleness to everything. And when you see like that thing of, what the Democrats put out today about like what their cop bill is going to be.
Outlaw chokeholds and
the same
anything
stuff
where they say police will be required to do X, Y, and Z before using deadly force is garbage, because the final arbiter of those things is the cop.
Yeah.
If it's a cop versus a criminal and the criminal's dead or even shot or injured in any way, and the cop says, I did it. I did X, Y, and Z. What the fuck what's going to say? Who's going to move against him? I mean, let's check his body cam. Oh, that was off. Weird. Right. How'd that happen?
I thought we required those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they banned chokeholds. Chokeholds were not part of NYPD training procedure when Eric Garner got fucking killed. At the end of the day, it's not only what a cop wants to do in the moment, it's what a cop knows he'll be able to get away with.
Right.
Which is essentially anything.
Yes. But yeah, it's this same dual day thing of the Biden campaign putting out. Well, I guess we already kind of went over this. Of course, the Biden campaign's not going to say, yeah, we're in favor of abolishing police departments. But it's the dual day thing of like Biden explicitly saying, my administration will not endorse any kind of structural change to anything.
Yeah.
And then the Democrats saying, we're going to instruct cops to trust more.
Yes. No, that's the only options, because at the end of the day, these are non-negotiable positions.
Yeah, you can't rearrange. The government has lost the power to rearrange power structures.
Yes. No, there's nothing. I mean, you'd have to get it through Congress,
which is immovable.
Immovable. Because it's like, there's all these demonstrations even in red states, right? But the political coalitions that have kept the Republican Party in power are still there,
right?
They still buffer them from a lot of those public views, and so they have no incentive to go along with anything you want to do. And the Democrats have every incentive in the meantime to turn everything into the most palatable version of itself, either the most meaningless or, even worse, the most insidious. We're going to break those cop unions. We'll also break those teachers unions at the same time. You did notice that they're both in the same bill. We can't get it through unless they're both together. Which one do you want?
Yeah,
that's the real danger. If there is not a coherence and a coordination that comes out of the next weeks, which I don't think you can say will happen or won't. And most likely it'll be on a scale. There will be formations that will emerge. The degree to which they can affect change is not to be known until the conditions present themselves.
And it's at the same time, it's lending to these massive cognitive dissonances where you have this, I guess maybe at this point, this one of the single largest consistent protest movement. I mean, I don't know numbers. I can't say if it's largest. Let me finish this.
Since the Vietnam War,
sure, since the Vietnam War. That is largely. I mean, what I saw was intergenerational, but it is largely younger people.
Yes.
Very here, at least here in New York, very racially mixed. And yet, over the weekend, I saw an interesting thing, and I think Felix retweeted this. That was looking at the voter turnout at the South Carolina primary and how Biden was able to turn the South Carolinian electorate into majority white for his election.
No.
And it just made me think of something that you told to me a few weeks ago, or said offhandedly, that's been rolling around in my mind, that at this point, electoral politics in this country is basically people over the age of 50 arguing about whether the 60s went too far or went just far enough.
Yeah. Yes, that's the difference between a boomer Republican, a white boomer Republican, and a white boomer Democrat, is whether they think the '60s were rad and far out, or if it was a damn shame. That's it.
Yeah,
and all the culture wars are just an echo of that wild battle in the skies that's been because they're the last generation that's squatting on the ever shrinking loot of treasure. Than the post-war boom, and so they're not giving up their cultural preeminence.
Yeah.
And so we get to just watch them fight about whether Sha Na Na was groovy or not. It's fun.
Well, I mean, at the time, Sean and I was even a '50s throwback band.
They were in the
then.
Woodstock. That's still hilarious.
Well, they were probably the most aesthetically reactionary band in Woodstock.
Yeah.
But that is funny. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that stat about the South Carolina primary electorate. I found grimly hilarious.
Yeah, because the danger was that there would be a coalescing of around one candidate among the more than anything the upper class Democratic white electorate, which is the predominating one in the primaries and in the party.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the ones who established the agenda. As long as they were divided, Bernie had a chance, unless he could have taken that time to build enough of a connection to a broader working class base of people who don't vote in primaries, which was the hope that we would get. Unless he had something to counteract that, if they unified, they were going to go, oh, good, we got to stop Bernie. And they did.
Yeah.
Because their class interests were for that to happen. And the fact that Bernie was not able to engage enough of the less affluent electorate, or more crucially, non-voters, that really shows that there's so much work to be done.
Right.
There's so much fucking work to be done. And hopefully there was some residual influence of the Sanders campaign. They moved the brick a little bit farther, down up the hill. And maybe this can connect to that and move it even further a little bit. That's the hope.
Or maybe rather it's bricks building a wall or something, and this is just another brick in it.
Another brick in the damn wall.
Another brick in the damn wall.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, think of it like Bernie built like a couple, like the first couple lines of masonry unevenly, and then the question is, how many more lines will we get from this? And that's up in the air. And I don't think you can assume either way. And you just have to make that damn leap of faith that gets us all to engage in behavior of any kind in this world.
Yeah, it's tough. And like when we talk about actual like affecting power, I mean, I think that's why so many people got so emotionally invested in the Bernie campaign, because it was a shot to
Yes.
It was almost like we were invested and we didn't realize in the time that we were like all trying to type out a cheat code at the same time. And in the end,
Right.
the cheat code didn't work.
Exactly. And that's because that's all we have left is cheat codes.
Yeah.
Because everything we know about how these things work is you assume the working class movement emerges out of the forges of capitalism, and then over time it engages with power in different ways, and that builds institutions, and then those institutions get undermined by conditions changing, compromises, loss of energy, things like that, and then over time they got dissolved, and so now we're trying to build from scratch, and no one knows how to do it.
Yeah.
And so it's like we're trying to paint a wall by just throwing paint at it. You don't have a roller. We don't have you just have big handfuls of paint that we're throwing at the wall until we can get it completely covered in the color.
Well, with that, let's go out even another lens out and talk about I'm trying to make this speaking of painting walls, but I don't know if I have an analogy here. Speaking of bricks, factories, the Satanic Mills, let's talk about history, and specifically, you kind of went off on a tear on your last stream about 1848.
Yes,
and I kind of wanted to bring that up. I forget what even the question was. I think somebody just put the numbers 1848 in the chat, and you spoke for about a half hour. But I think one of the things that you've been trying to do on your streams is find good analogies for this moment. Not only because it's fun, but it's also like useful to look at the past and learn from it. And the two that you settled on are 1848 and 1905. Can you elaborate, Mr. Chrisman?
I think the thing that come to mind with both of them is their spontaneous character and the degree to which they caught the existing socialist or left-wing movements as they existed completely off guard, because they emerged from just a sudden deterioration of legitimacy in the across Europe in 1848 and in the Russian Empire in 1905, and that led to this prolonged contest, which was eventually defeated in both cases due to its inability to, over the course of the time, stand up durable, effective counterweights to state authority, and eventually were divided and conquered in peace. And I think that there's a lot that echoes with this moment, 48 specifically, which started in Paris, and then the rest of Europe saw the uprising and realized simultaneously, from Prague to Vienna to Rome to
Hungary,
to Hamburg to Berlin, that shit, we could fucking do this. And so it spread throughout the continent. And then over time, every individual constituent piece of the revolution was rolled up by reaction due to its inability to organize broader structures within itself, and that happened in 1905 as well. But the key thing to remember about both of those is that they both left a residue of institutional memory and ideological coherence that was then picked up and utilized in future endeavors. I mean, Marxism really was forged in the Revolution of 1848. I mean, the communists, coincidentally, and it really just speaks to the way that like there is this in historical, there is like a geist that kind of moves through history, and people can kind of feel it, like like their hairs on end. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, just before the rebellions broke out.
Right.
And even though it was describing a condition of industrial labor that was still only a small fraction of Europeans actually engaged in, but they saw it coming, and they saw the 48 as the first gasps of crisis within this system. And it happened in 1905. The Bolsheviks and the SRs and everybody were caught flat-footed by 1905, but they came out of it more influential and more organized, and with a larger buy-in from the greater population than ever before. And that the moments like this are to be engaged with and seized and utilized with the knowledge that that is your best, the best thing that you should be hoping to can endure. Not necessarily what will happen, because conditions change and you have to move with conditions and recognize openings when they come. Because who the hell knows how fucking fragile this whole system is. We have no idea how close to the bottom of the Jenga tower they're pulling shit. You know? And I maybe the whole thing falls over tomorrow. I don't fucking know. But you cannot assume it. Think 48, though.
And that's one of the things that is like mind-bogglingly about going back to the seeming brittleness of the and inflexibility of any kind of government response. It's one of those things, that just makes more questions, because on one hand, that inflexibility makes it seem like is like a point of evidence on the nothing will ever change side. But then that same inflexibility is the same thing that, causes things to suddenly break.
Exactly. Brittleness, like when I was talking about brittle demands and a brittle agenda among demonstrators, there's also brittleness of institutions that are being pressed against. But the degree of that brittleness is not, you don't know it yet. You can guess, but these things are meshes of data that are beyond anybody's singular ability to absorb. So the brittleness is discovered in testing it, in dropping the bowling ball on the car, and seeing how big the dent is.
And of course, because this is America in the 21st century, we do have to then also factor in that the stupidest outcome will always be.
Oh yeah,
will always
Don't
be
forget
true.
That.
And that's like kind of the chaos element, right? Where the one thing you can bank on is that the stupidest thing will happen, but that is also usually something random and unpredictable.
Joe Biden in a dashiki.
Yes, let's see it. Let's
will
make it
happen.
It will happen.
He will have cornrows. He will take his hair plugs and put them into cornrows. And he will tell a very, very long story about going to see Car Wash in 1977 or whatever.
Man, they were kung fu fighting.
I'll tell you right now, it was a hell of a scene. People were passing marijuana joints and the hep cats. I called the cops.
That's going to be his inaugural address.
Yeah, he'll just be reciting the lyrics to Super Freak.
I think that's everything on my list. Anything else you want to talk about?
No, that's good. I feel like we've covered a good gamut here. Some musings.
Yes, musings. Start with Matt Chrisman.
Yeah.
Just to wrap things up here, again, I don't think we've ever mentioned that you've been doing these streams on the show.
Yeah, I just realized that today.
Kind of been your extracurricular project. If you like, I don't know, I have a feeling that this is going to be one of those insanely divisive episodes where exactly half the audience says that this is the worst one we've ever done, and half the audience says you should only do episodes like these from now on, which is how I know that the episodes are the best. When it has equal amounts of detractors and haters and lovers.
It's usually how it is in all things, isn't it?
Yeah. But if you like this, twitch.tv/Chapo Trap House. Matt has been going usually around 6 every day.
3 or 4 times a week, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'll do one today.
And it's all been leading up to the grill stream.
That's, I think, tonight, guys. By the time you listen to it, I might have already recorded it.
You might have
I
already
can't promise anything, but I think I'm going to inaugurate the grill tonight.